You can write them or you can put them in the chat. It's a good way because then Conrad can just look at them and kind of go in order. So your choice, whether you write them or not. Okay, that's it. And we are ready for the presentation. As you can see, it's on cognitive dissonance. Subtitle was just for fun, the what, the why, the WTF, assuming you all know what that is. And there we go. So the first thing is just what cognitive dissonance is. And you can see that big, long paragraph over there under the blue guy. It's a bit long to read, so I popped out the major points. The first thing is it's a mind state, if you will, or the tension that's caused in your thought processes by some discrepancy between some actions, attitudes, or beliefs that you or another person are taking. Another aspect or way of looking at it is the discomfort that's caused in your mind by simultaneously holding two or more contradictory thoughts. For those of you who know 1984, you are familiar with doublethink. Thing is what you've got is this tension or discomfort that it causes in your brain, which is why people tend to get upset. And so when that tension's there, there's some need that you have to resolve it one way or another. So some other things I put on, cognitive dissonance is universal in us humans. We always tend to believe or want to do a certain thing, and those who want to do it otherwise can sometimes just be either very bothersome or wrong in our way of thinking. And as I put, yeah, universal means everybody here today. So be aware of when you're going through this presentation, you are going to find yourself in here someplace. So pay attention and look for yourself in there. We all have it. As I said, I didn't make it up that it's universal. That guy did. For those of you who've seen Dogma, you appreciate that guy. Okay, so here's some of the theory about cognitive dissonance and what goes on in it. I've already said it's the conflict or discomfort that's caused in, psychologically. What you get is you can get information. You can also see actions or beliefs that are contrary to your established beliefs or the information you believe to be true. What this does, and this is particularly what makes people angry when they get into political or religious or other such discussions, is they attach their personal identity to the beliefs and ideas and actions that they want to take or that they hold. And so when you challenge it, they see it as a threat to their very own identity. And then your emotions get mixed up in that response. And then you're either going to have a fight or flee syndrome, basically. You're going to want to fight against this foreign, if you will, idea, or you just want to get the hell away from it. And very often when you do it, the information is just rejected, very often just out of hand without a discussion. But this keeps your prior belief and the personal identity you vested in it protected and preserved for that person. So hopefully that process gives you an idea of how this, when you talk to somebody like a Christian about atheism or a liberal about conservatism, they tend to get pissed a lot of times. So here's a bit more about the process. The first thing you've got is a choice between two items. I put over here this and that. You need to make some sort of a choice. So you make the decision. As you can see, the guy chose that. And then once you've made the decision, if it's something you haven't already decided on, what you do is you modify your preference for that item so that you get rid of the tension. That's the dissonance. And retroactively, once you've made the choice, you'll imagine in your mind that the thing you chose was actually better all along. And that will cause you to increase your preference for that item, decrease your preference for the other, and make it easy to resolve the tension or dissonance. And then that reduces the tension then. And now that dissonance resolution in the future can be faster. So that's why a lot of times you say, something contrary to a person's belief, and they just immediately dismiss it because they've already got the process established. Okay, future, and also the future encounters will actually reinforce the choices they made. So here's a bit more about it. You're making a difficult choice between chocolate or lemon cupcakes. Whoops. And then as you reject or choose one, it causes you to change your preferences. So now she thinks chocolate is great and lemon's kind of eh. And then that rejection or choice itself is kind of that pivot point where the dissonance is resolved. Once it does, you increase them accordingly. And then as said, over time, the choice for one gives way to the other choice, and you start to think that the one you rejected was actually bad. And whoops, hang on. And then the other one's the great and the only way to go. So what this causes is a lot of divisiveness among people over every kind of subject you can imagine, whether it's lemon, chocolate, politics, I don't like my country, or fuck you too. Not sure why you don't like Bono and company. Okay. This is about something called the backfire effect. I've often already talked about how people will make a choice and then pretend they really liked it all along. Over time, it becomes their fixed choice. So that guy's thinking, this is what I believe. You come along with new information, he immediately rejects it. And then you get what can be called a backfire effect. This is where any correction you give them, they'll actually so miscolor to reject it that it makes their misperception, they'll start to just misperceive things entirely, especially amongst those strongly committed. And then it reinforces their belief. So you can see, this is what he believes. No, I know it's true. We've all heard this in an argument. Mark Twain once said, it's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And people will reject things that are correct and think they're right. Anti-vaxxers are a good example. Now I'm going to kind of segue into the neural pathways in your brain that cause cognitive dissonance and drive you towards its resolution. So up above, I kind of go through things quick. You get this attitude change in response to the dissonance, the information that causes tension, and you're expected to favor the cognition or the idea, the thought that's resistant to change, so the one you've already picked. Again, if you're a Democrat, you're going to hang on to that and favor it and reject the conservative point of view. So there's data out there, and I'll show you a little bit of it, that suggests that the dissonance that's induced and the preference change you make to resolve it uses the same nerve pathways involved in your conflict monitoring and the implementation of you controlling how you think. So when you're increasing preference each time you choose something, you're actually causing changes in the neural pathways that have to do with that preference. This is part of why they get so hard to change your beliefs once they're fixed in. So this is an example of what cognitive dissonance can do with new or bothersome information, in this case, in science. So if you were looking at this, you can think of things like anti-vaxxers or creationists versus evolutionists, that sort of thing. So for non-scientists, it's very, very common to get some sort of cognitive dissonance in something that's evident in new scientific knowledge. Part of the reason is that new scientific knowledge is almost always in contradiction to some existing knowledge. This is just kind of the nature of discovering more about science. And the contradictions are frequently solved by simply saying, science isn't worth that much. And then they discard it. Very frequently with, science is always wrong. They're changing their mind all the time. And that's just not true. We're learning more. So then your new knowledge can frequently be discarded before its usefulness is established. Again, vaccines is a great example of this. A lot of people kind of get the idea that it doesn't work or they don't like the science of it. And then they just reject it without even waiting to find out that the things work really well. So it often takes a while to accept new knowledge, even amongst the scientific community, but especially amongst the general public. So this is where the scientific method comes in. It works for everybody to understand it, and it's very important for them to understand it because it helps to remove that dissonance you feel and understand that new knowledge helps you refine and improve your own. And so I said it usually works really well with scientists, but not always, which is why we have to apologize to Dr. Oswald Avery and Louis Pasteur. Most of you are familiar with Pasteur, who was one of the few scientists to really solidify the germ theory of disease, that a lot of our diseases are caused by bacteria or viruses. You may not know that the wide medical community largely thought he was full of shit, and he got a lot of arguments when he presented it. Oswald Avery is not as well known, but he's the guy who proved that DNA carries the genetic information that you can inherit and that causes traits like red versus blonde hair. Again, people completely poo-pooed him at a lot of presentations. I believe he was already dead before they gave him his Nobel. So we owe apologies to a lot of these guys for not only us, but even our scientists being idiots about cognitive dissonance. Just an idea of some other things that we resolve often with cognitive dissonance. Ideas that it screwed up. Here's the short list. And for those of you who know Winnie the Pooh, Rabbit's always getting disturbed by these crazy creatures he's surrounded with. And here's just a quick list of some ways that it messes things up, just so you can, again, get a feel of it. Healthcare providers, doctors and such get used to prescribing certain medications. So when new ones come out that are better, there's them resolving their dissonance. No, I like the way we used to do it or always did it. They should be learning not to be so resistant, not to be so dissonant about it. Politics, I don't even have to tell you much about how that gets messed up. Business, the phrase I hate the most. We've always done it this way. It should be like an automatic slap anybody that says that. Sunk cost effect was one I loved. You've got an investment that's going really bad, but you continue throwing money into it because you believe it's good and aren't going to change. Science, you've seen. Religion, we're all very familiar with. People just want to persist in their beliefs, even when you're showing something obvious. Language, as I said, people don't use grammar currently very well, but they sure don't want to use the new stuff. And that's a problem for me because I'm a grammar Nazi. So here's a brief brain brush up before I start going into structure of the brain, neural pathways and how they work. We're starting in with all the different areas of the brain having their major functions plus many minor functions. I don't expect you to memorize this entire thing, but you can see the list of the names with a little parenthesis showing some of their functions. Mostly they're just showing the major functions. If they showed the minor functions, those parentheticals would get pretty long. Then here's the other thing. They all have functions and they all communicate with one another. And the regions interact via white matter. You've probably all heard of white and gray matter. I'm going to get to what that is. So now white and gray matter in the brain. Gray matter, why didn't you go there? That's all those, sort of bulbous things that you see in the brain if you were looking at it. They're the information processing portions of the brain. They're like a computer's CPU. They process all information. Then you've got the white matter tracks. You can see how it's tracing those out with my animation. Those are all the nerves between gray matter areas that transfer information, like a computer circuitry or buses. So you can see the brain largely is like a computer. It's got a place to process information and store it, and it's got ways of carrying it back and forth between those. Again, because this is a nice picture, where it's gray, there, processing. Where it's long nerves, white matter, data transfer. And so you've got regions that interact frequently. And this is another thing I mentioned. You get what's called long-term potentiation. Oops. There we go. Potentiation I underlined because I'm going to talk about it in a minute. The sort of lines you see there are, again, showing increase of potentiation. I'll talk about it in just a minute. And then you can also get some new white matter connections that can be recruited from other parts. Whoops, my animation didn't work too well. The point is that if you've got white matter connections like that, a neural network can draft other white matter, whoops, I'm going backwards, there we go, can draft other white matter connections and recruit them from other functions when you need better communication between certain areas. So here's where I talk about potentiation so you know what this is. That is the signal strength or signal amplification that is produced by nerves when they're triggered. So go back to where this started. That represents just that, so you've triggered some nerves here and it generates a signal. Whatever the power of that signal is, that's the potentiation or the potential for that nerve or nerve pathway. Then when you get those nerves or bundles of nerves that get used as a pathway and you use them a lot, you go from a relatively ordinary single strength to something that is a lot stronger and fires perhaps more often, quicker, and more powerfully when it gets triggered. So this is how you, common association is if you learn a physical skill. At first, it's difficult because you're still figuring out the nerve pathways to, say, juggle. Once you've got it, it goes faster because the same nerve pathways fire. Whoops. The same nerve pathways fire, but they fire faster and stronger. That's a good example of anything you learn. Could also be like learning algebra when you go to calculus. So that's nerve potentiation. And now when it's strengthening the neural connections, part of it's increasing potentiation. It's also making connections. So my animations are running about one behind. When I was talking about strengthening the neural connections or increasing the potentiation, come on. There. Those pathways that you can see established, imagine that they started out like this, just small, weak pathways, but as you increase their potential, they get a lot thicker, and I made thicker to represent higher potential, that they'll fire faster. You can also make, I mentioned this, new connections. There it goes. So that's new connections. I've gone from here. I need, for some reason, some more connections to another area. So I make them through a different line. So you can draft, you can either make new pathways and increase their potentiation, or you can draft other pathways or reroute. And this sort of rerouting, changing, raising potential, it's all part of what's called brain plasticity. You think about plastic, it's malleable. This is the brain's ability to repair or reroute functions. And a really important place where this comes in is the brain being able to correct damage by things caused like trauma, either psychological or physical, or attacks of multiple sclerosis. Those are both things that can damage a particular area. And in order to learn, say, to walk properly again, your brain will reroute, draft new connections, and strengthen them. I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the regions and the kind of functions they have. And I'm not even getting to like most of the sensory functions or motor functions. Mostly I'm just talking about psychological ones because they fit cognitive dissonance. Remember, there'll be an exhaustive test on this later. So this is one that'll be important, the frontal lobe, which controls the executive and logical functions. This is really important because when you're just a young child, this lobe isn't connected too well. That's why children will do stupid stuff like run straight at a wall and hit it. Eventually, they learn solid objects are not good ideas to hit. That's executive or logical functioning. Whoops, there's that. That's just a particular part of the frontal lobe that also is involved with anger, strangely enough, and conflict resolution. Remember that conflict detection and resolution is part of the neural pathways that are triggered when you have cognitive dissonance. I mentioned that earlier. Okay, I just happened to hit this, the right temporal lobe, language memory, and importantly, emotional control. Again, part of dissonance. The frontal lobe, emotional impulse management. Again, very important to dissonance, trying to control your emotions or stimulate them. That's what I call the ACC, anterior cingulate gyrus, or cortex. That's conflict resolution, where you pay attention, how you interact with people. You'll see later that's another important center involved in dissonance. Hippocampus, that's where you store and process new memories. And this thing called the amygdala, that is where all your basic emotions, the ones that just tend to trigger almost without thought, that's where they tend to come out of. So here's where I show you some of the main connections. The area that's always involved in cognitive dissonance is that the part of the frontal cortex that I mentioned before, that's involved in the logical executive functions, and it helps you to just avoid things that you don't like. So this is a good center to trigger if you want to walk away from a political discussion. This area right here behind it, which is near the center of the brain, often processes emotions, and they tend to get active when people are upset or angry. That and the medial frontal will interact, and you get somebody who gets angry, and they're even more likely to walk away from a conversation. This DLPFC, who cares about that long name? Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you want to know. That's very much associated with the control of your thoughts and trying to reduce the conflict in your mind. So it's this frontal thing, again, is the executive and logical part of your brain. If we could keep only that activated during cognitive dissonance situations, we all would be able to have rational discussions about politics. And then the ACC I mentioned earlier, anterior cingulate cortex, that'll monitor dissonance or conflict, and then it'll try to help resolve them. So it's kind of interesting that the back of the brain and the front of the brain are both involved in dealing properly, if you will, with cognitive dissonance. And this thing doesn't even mention that down here close to the brainstem, you get some interaction from there that's pretty close to instinctive. So as you make your decision stronger and you start to increase the preference for whatever you chose, this area down near the brainstem gets kind of to be part of the whole neural network for cognitive dissonance. And that's why the anger just kind of gets triggered before the thought. It's right by the brainstem, almost instinctive. Now I'll show you how some of those regions I just mentioned tend to interact. You can see there, I'll flash up again, the number 1. There's an interaction between the executive and logical portion of your brain and what it tends to pay attention to. This is a good idea of connecting what you're looking at and what you're going to do about it. So that's not bad for the dissonant situation. Down here, the second one, where your logical part goes back to, whoops, sorry, I'm going to back it up here. There, your logical portion of your brain goes back to your memory processing and storage. It's a nice connection to have. It really helps with things. There's where your selective attention attaches to your learning and memory. So if you're only paying attention to certain things and asking for certain memories, you start to have trouble. And then here's the connection that seems to be so strong with dissonance and causes so much trouble. Your selective attention, let me show you again, that line there, your selective attention from the ACC and your emotions. This is why people, when they have a political argument, they only hear part of what you say. It's what they selectively pay attention to. And then it feeds straight back into the emotions, and you get people getting pissed off. And lastly, there's your emotions and your memory getting tied together. So first, let me get back there. You only pay attention to certain things and hook it to your emotions. And then those emotions go and hook to your memory. And the next thing you know, you've got a very emotional response to what you chose to pay attention to, and you pull that information alone out of your memory. Makes discussions difficult. So that's just a little bit of the routes that your brain neural systems will take in dealing with cognitive dissonance. And when you're making the choices and choosing your preferences initially, as I was showing back in those previous slides, that uses all the same pathways. So these get strengthened every time you deal with a situation that can cause dissonance for you. And I just wanted to highlight something here. all the orange regions, there we go, are areas that get involved with different aspects of cognitive dissonance. All those regions are orange. Do you notice any area missing from a lot of the action? And it's kind of funny. This gets involved the least in cognitive dissonance. The frontal lobes, where your executive and logical functions are lodged. Again, just look at that. All that gets involved in the brain when you have dissonance. That does not tend to get involved. Another reason why dissonant conversations can be quite angry without a lot of thought going on. So here's the question. I said it's universal. Are we really hardwired just to be a dissonant species? Those are some of the arguments for why maybe we are this way. I already showed that these processes get involved, and then over time, that frontal portion gets less involved. So that's our very nervous system showing a tendency to dissonance. And the important thing is that these things happen every day without you even thinking about it. You detect some sort of problem that needs resolution with the ACC, and then it refers to the prefrontal cortex to help apply executive function towards resolving it. So this is just a great idea, a great example of the ACC might register, we have a conflict here. We're about to get attacked by a dog. That's definitely a conflict. The PFC will probably say, run and climb over the nearest fence. So again, this shows a lot of your perceptions and thoughts will initiate. And again, little or no conscious deliberation. You almost have no time to think about things like this. I put in a good example of this is perhaps you see a fight, you steer clear of it. ACC sees the fight or perceives the conflict. The PFC will say, hey, just stay clear. Another example, you see somebody driving crazy on the road. You slow down, maybe switch lanes, let him get ahead of you so that you're not in danger. Now, here's a study that was done indicating we might be hardwired. So you get a cognitive dissonance associated with neural activity in that left frontal cortex. This is a little back from where your logical section is. You can see it, associated with anger and conflict resolution. That's why a lot of people resolve conflicts by getting into a fight. As you can see, anger motivates activity in the LFC. And then the relation between cognitive dissonance and anger is supported by that activity. It's why the more people are combative, when people are combative very often, it tends to become almost their default option. They become more combative or violent. And this is to indicate kind of the whole process that can get involved in dissonance resolution. So LFC gets activated. Let's see, it goes too fast. Causes you to try to take control of a situation. If you can't get in control of the situation, it stresses you out. Then your negative emotions arise to solve it, and your behavior frequently becomes socially inappropriate, as in fights and screaming and that sort of stuff. The reason I put it as a circle here is by the time that you get around to becoming angry or socially inappropriate, it's going to start to cycle right back, feed into it. Again, you know, often if somebody's about to get into a fight, they start to say angry, stupid shit, and it escalates. It follows just this process. And something that's important about it that I showed earlier is a lot of this happens without you thinking about it. It's gone faster than you could have thought about it. more about why we may be hardwired. Something called tribalism. We're all familiar with this. We trust our group more than others. Yeah, we trust our group. We listen to our tribe. Why? Because we want security and belonging to them. This is where your personal identity gets in. Other thing is, we don't understand the ways of the other tribes. You can think of it as Indian tribes like this, where they don't know what others do, or you can think of it as your liberal conservative tribe, and you don't know what the conservative tribe thinks. So you tend to stay where you are. Part of this is good because it's good for survival. You know, they help aid survival. You don't want to go off on pathways you don't understand far from your tribe. So you stay with them and sort of stay in the pathways and the areas they're used to. If you've seen the cartoon film Moana, great example of this. Daughter was not supposed to leave the island because it's dangerous out there. Now, here's an idea of why we are not hardwired for cognitive dissonance. And this to me was really interesting. Children when they're young, they quickly develop this appreciation for a distinction between actual knowledge for something and being ignorant about it. We've all seen this get screwed up in adult arguments. They also appreciate a distinction between reality and simple belief. They can also start to understand that other people have false beliefs. They know what reality is. They see simple belief and go, they don't correspond. That person's nuts. They show that even preschoolers know that story events don't happen in reality. There aren't really any flying horses. Bible miracles is a good example of this. I'm going to touch on it in the next slide. And here's something. Young people recognize that a lot of people are prone to believing stuff that isn't real. I don't think a lot of us realize that little kids actually know a lot of this stuff. And what's important is that the environment they're raised in heavily influences how they start to process and categorize as they get older. That's why if you're born into a European family, you tend to think like a European and look at the world like that. And if you come to America, you very frequently think we're crazy. So I figure if this kid can put together that thing and understand all these differences, maybe they should put our brains together and tell us how to use them. We could learn from them. This is a study I mentioned about differences between different types of stories and children understanding it. They've tested the ability of children to distinguish realism from fantasy and found that even preschoolers could consistently distinguish the difference. In older children, the older they got, they began to have different groups emerge. They didn't all make the distinctions. Some continued to know the difference pretty well. Some began to lose the ability to tell the difference. They started thinking magic was real. And I just make the mention that the two groups are not, completely dichotomous. There's a range between them. It's important to remember. So here's a study where they took school-age children and they asked them to read religious stories, general societal or known mythologies, and fantasy stories. With the mythological and fantasy stories, pretty much all children understood fantastical or magical elements versus realistic. Children from non-religious homes could continue to distinguish fantasy and reality in the religious stories. Children from the religious homes we're less likely to distinguish fantasy or reality in those religious stories. You get taught to think the Bible is real, you start to think all those miracles really happened. And frankly, no, seas still do not part before people waving sticks. So again, the environment makes the difference between how you process or categorize narratives. I think that while the stuff earlier about the neural pathways indicates we're hardwired, most of those studies were done with older people, young adults and older adults. When they started doing practical stories like this in young children, it looks like we're not so hardwired, and it's your upbringing that can maintain that ability to distinguish or ruin it. Here's some things about why cognitive dissonance develops. You've got family beliefs and the people you hang around. That's your tribalism. You got information sources that you're exposed to and tend to access. And then the phenomenon known as the echo chamber. I love this phenomenon because I can just see a bunch of different people in farm silos all staying in there talking to themselves. This is when you're exposed only to news that reinforces your belief, so it feeds back to that and strengthens it. And separate groups of people who tend to interact completely. Just a second here. Okay, I worded that badly. When you have a group of people that interacts with the news stories and political realities within their own echo chambers, it generates and perpetuates tribalism, and it creates more divisions in society. Whoops. And so again, I worded that badly. If you have a group of people that are in one echo chamber, other people tend to be in different echo chambers. And that's why we develop different tribes or groups that we only trust, and why we began to develop all those divisions that we have that cause so much trouble. Here's something else about why cognitive dissonance develops. I call it mental laziness. Truths are not, they can be very inconvenient. They can also be unpleasant and discomforting. They can inspire cognitive dissonance, in other words. Also, it's hard work to determine exactly what's true and then to understand it and live by them. But your lies, half-truths and the like, they're comfortable, they're reassuring, they're easy to live with in your tribe or echo chamber. And it's not that hard to find them and support them. You can pretend to understand. It's just not important. So what I got here is the truth tends to be the ugliest thing in the world if you're on the wrong side of it, because it is so damn hard and difficult to affirm. There's some more about it. Families and information sources. This is why it persists. You can see that it's basically the same reasons it develops to start with. They support it. Your echo chambers are usually your social group, so you're not going to associate with anybody else. And if you change some behavior or element of yourself, you can be ostracized from your social group or your echo chamber. There's something about how bad can cognitive dissonance really be? I said it causes divisions. Yeah, dangerous beliefs and actions can arise. They can persist. They can grow. They never get questioned by certain people. And you can wind up with January 6th or the Westboro Baptist Church. Totally wacko beliefs, but they stay in their echo chambers, and they hear something that conflicts, they use resolution for cognitive dissonance and just hold on to what they have because it's comfortable and they don't get ostracized from their tribe. Okay, so a little bit more about it. I said social divisiveness can grow. Red versus blue, Republican or conservative versus liberal or Democrat. The one up in the upper right is how things really should mix. We've got sort of, reds and blues divided, that there's a lot of room in the middle. The next one next to it, you start to see them dividing and establishing tribes. And the one at the bottom, you can see there's hardly any connections left between them. They hardly overlap. This is your divisiveness between, again, red and blue, or whatever you want to think about it. You can wind up with a different color of division, blue and gray. And that was pretty much largely up to just divisiveness that couldn't be resolved in this country, and ended up being resolved with a war. And that is what it can lead to. Some other things that it can do is it can let you elect leaders that do horrible things and make people who follow them no matter what, even if it conflicts with reality. I mentioned Godwinism. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Godwinism is a principle you often hear that basically says if Hitler or the Nazis come up, the conversation's over. Michael Godwin, who's the poor fellow associated with this, hates the concept, and it's not what he said in the first place. It's been misinterpreted. But you all know if you hear Hitler or Nazis, you kind of just want to walk away from the conversation. Michael Godwin himself said straight out, when Trump was in and people asked him about it, he says, yeah, you damn sure should compare him to Hitler. It works pretty damn well. And if you do compare them and you line up Trump's actions with Hitler's, it's horrifying. I actually did this. I've got a list of going through how Hitler came to power, how he perpetuated power, his specific actions lined up with the orange one. And it really was terrifying to do it. So here's something to learn. If you won't talk about history like Hitler and Nazis, that's the best way not to learn history's lessons. And then you go on and repeat the damn stuff. And now here's some ways that you can overcome cognitive dissonance, or at least minimize it. First thing, acknowledge your own biases. If you hide from those, you're never going to even get off the starting block. When you're looking for something, analyze it carefully. Look for verification. Look for independent sources that can verify it, as well as collective ones, and find people who've taken accountability for what you're looking at. And you have to take the accountability too. Importantly, seek out views that challenge your own beliefs. People just tend to follow the same news sources and echo chambers. That's what I'm talking about. Go find sources and people who will challenge that belief. My favorite, learn to argue all sides of any issues. I really love doing this because then I'll walk in, people think I'm a conservative, or people think I'm a liberal, and I'll argue in favor of gun control or something. Throws them off. Try to get past emotional responses that pop up and start engaging your critical thinking. Remember that those emotional responses follow those neural pathways that get triggered immediately and without you even being aware of it. You have to feel that emotional response, shut it down, throw the whole process up to the front of your brain where it's executive and logical, and start going through it critically without the emotions associated. Then go out and engage with people and news outlets that you disagree with. You've already looked at their sources. Go talk to them. You can argue all sides, or you can just listen to them. and you don't have to argue a thing. You have to also be open to new perspectives and informations that might actually change your point of view. Often the other side is not proceeding without evidence, and you may be unaware of it. And then I put avoid the 4 cognitive biases, which are bias that you don't have biases. A lot of people think they don't. No, we all do. Avoid the bias that you are better, kinder, smarter, nicer, more moral, etc., than the average person. You're not. You're pretty average. Avoid confirmation bias. We all know this. You know, you believe the sky is, I don't know, purple. And then one day, for some reason, the sky is purple and you can say, see, ignoring the thousands of other days when the sky was blue. And selective exposure. That's a bias. You just go for the sources you like. And then that way you avoid dissonance, which is another one of the parts of your brain I referred to earlier. That, you know, you just go to things that don't cause dissonance in the first place. Here's something else about overcoming cognitive dissonance. Expose yourself completely to things that are in opposition to how you feel or believe. Teach yourself to argue all sides. Those were both in before to some extent. I'm just highlighting them because these are ones that are probably the most important. Now you notice what I put up here, Fox News, and if you look in that group there, Trump's in there somewhere. So here's what I thought putting it up. I bet you just experienced cognitive dissonance. You saw Fox News and recoiled. You saw the Republican debate with Trump in it. You were sickened. I told you, you might just find yourself in here somewhere. I bet for a lot of you, I did. A little bit more about resolving it. These are things that can happen when you resolve it, or things you can choose. You could actually change your behavior. This is probably the most difficult thing to do when something that is dissonant comes before you, to actually say, I was wrong. It's time to get on the right side of the truth, no matter how ugly it is. Good example, if you're smoking, stop because it causes cancer. Change your behavior. You can change the environment you're in. So you can either associate only with people who agree with you, or I should have put here with people who disagree. Like smokers could only hang out with other smokers. I didn't put it here, but contrarily, they could only hang out with non-smokers and get used to it. You can also add some new element, like reading material critical of the information you didn't like, or finding ways to sidetrack the issue. Good way to find material you don't like if you're a smoker, pseudoscience. That helps with almost anything. Another good way to change or sidetrack the issue is to use logical fallacies. Red herrings are one that a lot of people love. You talk about smoking and they say, yeah, well, more people die in car accidents. Those are two totally different things. They're not related. And we're talking about smoking it now, right now anyway, so leave the cars out of it. And lastly, you can just avoid dissonant information. You just don't read the side of cigarette packs, and you don't engage with people who disagree with you. And if somebody says smoking is harmful, you just say, I don't want to talk about it, or you walk away. That's a lot of what it is, why it is, and what you can do about it. The only thing I kind of wanted to put at the end here is a principle I've followed for a lot of years, and it has made me change my own beliefs on a number of occasions and changed them considerably. I don't care what the truth turns out to be. I just want to find out what it is and then get on the correct side of it. And that